Our next speaker would be Suman Chakraborty. He is a senior DevOps engineer at SAP Labs, Bangalore. He is managing and supporting DevOps for SAP ABAP on Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes platform. Suman loves to speak and engage with community on various open source and cloud native topics ranging from Cloud Foundry, Kubernetes, serverless, and DevOps. He has been a distinguished speaker in different tech conferences that includes Linux Foundation event, Hashicorp, and CNCF sponsored events, DevOps Summit, Collabnix, and CNCF Data Management User Group. And the topic he'll be walking us today is from build to release. Let's codify all the things. So with that, a warm welcome to Suman.
Thank you, Savita.
Thank you.
My voice is clear and it's audible.
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, and hello to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining this Collabnix event. I'm really excited to be part of this event, and so today I'll be basically going through one of the key tool which basically helps in giving a very good experience from the developer perspective. So let me share my screen. Okay, I hope my screen is visible. Okay, so yeah, so the topic that I'm going to discuss about today is basically from build to release. Let's codify all the things. So this is just to give you an idea about how we can simplify our DevOps lifecycle in managing, in basically building, managing, and deploying our software application on any platform. So a bit about myself. Well, I'll just quickly go through since Savita has already introduced me. So I'm currently working as a senior DevOps engineer with SAP Labs India, and I'm a speaker in the open source community in the Linux Foundation event and in different other CNCF sponsored events such as Camp Cloud Native and the Collabnix, Docker Bangalore, and DevOps India Summit. I do write articles on different tech that includes platform as a service technologies with cloud native, serverless, Kubernetes, and monitoring on different social media platforms. And when I'm not talking or writing articles, I'll be traveling, and I'm a great foodie. So coming into the agenda, so what we are going to see today is first we need to understand the developer lifecycle, the current that is in existence, and the challenges that is included with this current scenario, and how Waypoint as one of the tools provided by Hashicorp simplifies this development pipeline. And then we are going to understand the advantages and use case of Waypoint from the developer perspective, and then a quick demo around this solution. So let us try to understand the current developer lifecycle. So if we see the current lifecycle can be comprises of 7 different phases, which starts extreme left with coding, and then it moves into the testing, to the build phase, deploy, and then to the release, and then you start operating the applications on any platform, and then measuring, and measuring that includes monitoring, observability, logging, and all those features. Now, it has been seen in the on a wider aspect from the organization perspective or from the community's perspective. We have a defined set of tools which are basically defined for 2 different phases that are defined for coding as well as testing, and on the right hand side for operating and the measuring. So if we see on the coding side, people tend to use the Visual Studio for writing their code, while GitHub is naturally used as one of the tool where basically you can store your source code, and that can be used across different platforms. Once the application is coded, there has to be certain test cases which has to run and validate that code, which can be run through some tools, open source tools, Circle CI or Selenium tools that could basically do certain in testing on this on your application code. While leaving the middle, coming into the operating side, again, we have a well-defined standard set of tools that is taking care of the application that you are planning to deploy. So whether your application is a VM-based application, then you basically manage that using Terraform, or you have Moment that can actually take care of it. Or if your application is more on the is more deployed as a container, you would basically choose something like Docker Swarm or Kubernetes to deploy it on the platform. And then once the application is live, you basically set it to be monitored through certain observability tools such as Datadog or Grafana or Prometheus to get the statistics of the utilization of the resources within the application, and if there are any bottlenecks that is experienced by the end users. Now, the problem lies here in the middle phases, which is like build, deploy, and release. What we see that there is no proper standard that is defined in these three different phases. So there are quite a number of tools that are available in the community as well as in the enterprise segment, and it all depends on the type of requirements where we need to choose a specific tool and implement the logic on that. And what also we observe is that this basically provides a very fragmented and uneven mix of deployment strategies. So you have different set of integrations that is coming in the deployment phase. Let's say, for example, if you are going to deploy on a VM-based server, then you choose a set of tools for that. If it is on a controller-based environment, then you choose a certain set of tools. If it is a serverless-based deployment, then you might choose, say, Lambda or Cloud Run for that. And then release is also where where it has been seen that there are certain domain-specific skills which are currently lacking, and that actually doesn't translate to multiple platforms for which the software build happens. So the concerns that are being raised by the developer is that it doesn't matter that where the application would be deployed, but to basically concise the approach or to make the approach more homogeneous in basically taking an application from the build to deploy is what is requested or is needed from the end developer perspective. And as a developer, you don't care about how your code gets deployed, but you need to basically have a seamless approach in delivering the application. The third thing is that the developer obviously doesn't want to basically have more headache in managing the infrastructure, because he wants it to be actually seamlessly managed by the tools that he is using. And developer wants a better interface, a good UI interface that can basically help in building the cloud-native CI/CD pipelines. So, how these challenges can be solved? Well, Hashicorp has basically developed one of the very finest tool, which I would say that I have seen till date, and which is called as Waypoint, that actually tries to solve this problem. So, Waypoint is basically provides a modern day workflow to build, deploy, and release your software across any platform, and the entire configuration and the entire deployment configuration is driven through a single file, which is called as a waypoint.html. is completely written in Hashicorp language. And what you do basically, you have the source code and you have the manifest, and together you just use the command called waypoint up. So it's like quite intention, or maybe it is always expected that Hashicorp always brings up some of the commands which always try to do the entire deployment, whether it's a vagrant up or something like that. It will do your deployment right from taking the scratch, taking your source code and to the deployment. And then it basically takes it together, and using Waypoint up, you deploy it on your target platform. That can be an EC2 instance, that can be a Google Kubernetes engine, that can be a serverless platform such as Lambda or Cloud Run, or even or in the Kubernetes cluster also. So let us understand about the tool Waypoints. Waypoint basically provides a single configuration file that is written in a common language as a code, which is again Hashicorp language, and it provides an end-to-end build, deploy, and release strategy for your application, and provides a quick workflow how you are going to deploy your application. So if you see, we basically create a file where we define something called as a project. And in the build phase, what happens? The build is basically where all your application dependencies and configurations are compiled, validated, and configured into an artifact. Sometimes this artifact can be pushed into the local repository or can be sent into a remote registry from where that artifact would be used in the second phase, which is the deploy phase, where the application is staged, but it is not actually released to end users, but it is staged to be deployed. So, and in the release phase, what happens? This stage application is then basically made, is exposed to the end user by configuring the appropriate DNS configuration in the infrastructure side, as well as the load balancer configuration, whatever it is required. And this is how Hashicorp achieves a seamless, Hashicorp's Waypoint tool achieves the simplest workflow of creating the complete build, deploy, and release work lifecycle for the developer. And this is the output when we run on Waypoint command. So it basically streams all the events that is happening in your terminal. And what are the coolest feature of using this particular tool in achieving this complete lifecycle is that it gives you certain developer-friendly features. So as a developer, I want that when I deploy an application, I should get some idea about whether the deployment has been done successfully or if there are any issues I can debug. So that is what Waypoint Logs give. It basically helps you to provide a simplified debugging experience on that particular application. Helps you to gather logs that is coming from multiple target platforms and environment, and that is what it gives. So it is not a replacement of a persistent storage where you can actually send the logs, but it is more on the runtime where you can see what are the events that is happening during deployment of the application. The other coolest feature that it provides is giving a Waypoint Exec. Waypoint Exec is more about telling that you can actually log into the deployment by giving through a shell access, and you can execute certain remote commands. Let's say you have to debug certain deployment. You don't want to actually debug right from the source code, but you want to debug in your deployed application. Then you can use this tool to do that, and you can basically debug the code and everything that is available directly from the deployment side. Well, one of the key aspects of using Waypoint is to basically achieve a complete CI/CD based solution. So it basically helps to drive the CI/CD implementation. It basically has a developer agnostic pipeline driven strategy that basically helps in achieving that. It allows to do different post deploy validation. It allows for workflow portability, and most importantly, it allows to give you the metrics that is happening across the different stage of the DevOps lifecycle. And how does it achieve all these things? Because of the extensible interface. So if we see across different phases, whether it's a build, deploy, and release, the tool actually integrates with almost all the available frameworks or the tools that is available. Let's say during the build, it can actually work with any of the development language, whether your code is built on Java, whether it's built on Python, Node.js, React. It can actually take the code and deploy it in the platform that might be running a Kubernetes cluster, might be running AWS Lambda function. Even if you're planning to run as a GitOps model, it can actually do that. And in the release phase, you can release it across any target platform. That can be any cloud provider platform, an on-prem solution, or maybe as a ChatOps model via Slack. That is possible actually. So enough of talk. So let us quickly go into the demo to see how we can basically see these things in action. So I have my Kubernetes cluster running in the GK environment, which I have already set up. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to first set up the Waypoint server. So first, what is needed is a Waypoint client, and I have already set up that just to reduce time for doing the demo. And if we see here, basically the Waypoint version it is giving is 0.3.3, and this is the Waypoint version which was actually released yesterday with some very important features like providing the GitHub tools, GitHub action that you can actually do with this, and also the GitOps integration that was possible has been enabled through this feature, and some other cool features. So What we are going to do now is first we are going to set up the Waypoint server. For that, I use Kubernetes since I'll be using a target platform as Kubernetes since I'm already running in my cluster. So what I do, I choose Waypoint install and platform Kubernetes, and then I have to accept the terms of service. So what is TOS here is basically when Waypoint basically uses or basically does the deployment of your artifact. It basically publishes that into an internal URL, which is actually not routable outside the cluster, but as a Waypoint user, you can basically validate the URL to see whether your application is running perfectly or not before being released onto a public IP, which is actually being given by a load balancer. So once you accept this terms of service, then you will be allowed to use that Waypoint URL functionality that is being provided internally from the server side. So what this command does, this is basically checking whether there is, it is basically deploying certain Kubernetes resources because Waypoint uses the Kubernetes platform to deploy the resources, a few bunch the deployment of certain set of pods, services, and stateful service to run the server. And you can have this server running on any platform. So here I have chosen Kubernetes, but you can install it on Docker. You can install it on your EC2 platform. You can choose any platform to deploy this server. So we'll wait for a few minutes for the server to set up. So once this is set up, it will basically provide me with a public URL, which would be the Waypoint URL that will help me to connect to a dashboard kind of thing. So here is the web UI that it has created, and since it is on HTTP, I have to basically ignore this. And what I have to give is a Waypoint token because it actually authenticates from the server side. So I just create a new token for this using the Waypoint token command. And here I place this token and I authenticate it. So as I can see, this is the UI of the Waypoint, and currently there are no projects running because I haven't registered any projects here. One good thing about this Waypoint is that you can actually switch between multiple contexts. So if I do a Waypoint context list, so I can see that I have a different set of deployments that are actually running here. So here is basically where you can set up your, let's say, dev environment, or you are trying to run on a staging environment or production environment, and you can use the same server to switch your context and run or basically do the complete release management for your application. So you don't have to install the server onto every other node to basically do the deployment. So it basically helps you to switch the context from a single server. So once I have done it and set it up the Waypoint server, the next thing is that I need to clone my repository. So I have a simple one, and I'm going to basically clone my repository here. And this is a simple Golang application that will just print a hello world command. And the main thing that has to be seen here is how we define the Waypoint itself. And so as you see, as I have already told you earlier, that Waypoint basically, it is driven completely by a configuration that we write using the Hashicorp language. So here you have the project where you are defining that what is the app you are going to deploy. And that app basically comprises of 3 different phases: the build phase, the deploy phase, and release phase. So in the build phase, I have the option to go with either Docker, or even I can go without Docker file strategy, that is using something called as cloud native, using something called as a cloud native Buildpacks. Pack is the CLI that is basically using this cloud native Buildpacks. In my case, I'll be using the Google cloud native Cloud native Buildpacks to basically OCI complaint image directly from the application source. And then in this case, I'll be using the Docker registry where I'll be pushing my application from where in the deployment phase, I'll be taking the application and do a deployment. So this is we called as a stage deployment where the application is not actually released to the end users, but we create an internal endpoint URL so that it can actually we can actually use and test whether the application is running fine or not. And then in the release is where we basically publish this URL to be exposed on a production IP that is basically provided by a load balancer. So once I have the code available, and I will also show, so this is simple Golang script that basically will print hello world and nothing else, not much fancy deployments here. So the next thing that I'll be doing is I have to initialize waypoints so that waypoint knows that which particular project it has to manage. So it will do certain checks. It will see whether your waypoint HCL file is correct or not from the configuration side. If there are any configuration issues, it will immediately detect and print out here. It will also authenticate your project to be used from the Waypoint server, and then it will load the necessary plugins and runtimes that it is needed. So now if I go to my UI screen, I can see that it has already detected my project, and there is my application hello world, the directory. But if I see there is no deployment or no release as created because I haven't basically used Waypoint to create the workflow. So now what I would be doing is create the complete workflow that is done using the Waypoint run. But before that, I'll also show you that if you don't want to do the complete build, deploy, release in one step together, you can actually have 3 different steps using the build, deploy, and release, where you can simply build the artifact for your source image, and later you can use that artifact to be deployed separately, or you can just run the deploy to deploy the push artifact on the staging side, and then releasing the deployment. So you can independently choose which particular step you need to achieve or you need to do. For our case, I'll just deploy the whole thing together. So I'll just put waypoint up. And this will basically take my source code, and using the fact CLI, it will try to create the OCI image directly using the builder that is available from the Google Cloud Buildpacks. So it takes some time first to detect what is the available runtime that would be needed for your application, creating the lifecycle for the Buildpacks, the usual Buildpack phases that it could go, data analyzing and building that particular artifact. So once this is done, basically it will then move into the deployment, into pushing the artifact into the registry, which in my case, it will push into the Docker registry. And here you can see that it has generated the image for me, tagging the image with the latest, and then it's pushing to my registry. So once the artifact has been pushed, now in the second phase, in the deployment, it would basically connect to the Kubernetes server, and then basically it will create the deployment. It will wait for the deployment to be available, basically ensuring that the pods are ready before it can actually publish this deployment for the end users on a load balancer. And here in this releasing phase, it is basically publishing, basically creating the service, the load balance. So the load balancer service in this case. So it should be up in some time now. Yeah, and the service is ready. So once the deployment is done, it will basically provide me with two different URL. One is the release URL and one is the deployment URL. The deployment URL, as I was telling, it is basically provided as an internal routable URL, which is provided by the Waypoint itself, and this is not basically published to the end users. And the release URL is the one which is published to the end users. So if I just click on this, I should see my application running. And so this is how you can see the application is being printed as hello world. Now, basically, I can also see here the resources that it has basically deployed in my case. And I should see here a certain bunch of resources that is deployed in the default namespaces with hello world as the pod running, and the deployment with hello world and the services that it has basically point here in the hello world as a load balancer IP, which I'm basically connecting, and a replica set here. So pretty simple, right? So now as I get the URL here, I should also get the details similar in the UI dashboard as well. So here you can see that basically it has deployed all the three different phases. One with the build phase, and where I can see the various builds that happen. So the pack CLI has basically created the artifact, so I can get the ID here. And then in the deployments, I can see what is the stage deployment URL that it has published. And in the releases is that basically it provides load balancer IP to set the URL for my application. Now, as I was mentioning that as a developer, I also want to see what are the logs that are being shown for my deployment that I've done, and that I can get it here. These are not, not all the logs, but yeah, just the runtime logs. So I can maybe in a separate terminal tail the logs using Waypoint Logs -m and get the streaming out logs there. Similarly, I can also connect to the deployment using the exec command. I'm just providing a shell access, and I'll be connected to the deployment, which is V1 in this case. So whenever Waypoint does a deployment, it always it basically creates a version for itself. So the first deployment is always named as V1. The next deployment, what we'll be doing, is named as V2, something like that. Okay. And this is where I get the access of my application. And inside I'm this directory, and here you can go and change the configuration as required, or modify certain image layer certain configuration related properties that is required for your application, for the deployed application. So this is about how you can go and do a deployment. Now, if I have to do the change again on my application, I can simply do the change and run a waypoint up, which will basically create a newer deployment with V2 that will basically be published same here. So in the from the UI also you can get the logs that is coming. Some of the functionality is still not accessible. So I would say from the from the debugging purpose, if you have to do, you can basically rely on CLI to do those things, where your UI can be basically used to get an overview of your app deployment. So one more thing is that here you can basically get to invite this particular server among your colleagues or peers who are working in the team, so that they can get a share access of the server and they can also view the deployment. So no need to run servers separately for different users as it is needed. So now, once you do the deployment and you feel that you are done with it, you don't need to go and clean up your individual Kubernetes resources. What you can simply do is Waypoint destroy. And Waypoint destroy basically will give you to, okay, so what basically the current version of Waypoint has done that only the authenticated or the admin users can actually run this, and since this will destroy all the resources that are created, it asks you to basically run this with the auto approve command. So this would basically will delete all the resources that are created during this deployment phase, and will basically clean up your entire all the Kubernetes deployments that is there, and so you will have nothing in running. except the Waypoint server and all, yeah, all the details. So you can see this is already terminating and should be terminated in some time. Actually, the service, yeah, they should also be in some time. So coming into the requirement then. So how Waypoint basically helps the developer. So basically Waypoint instills confidence for a developer to carry out the complete build deployment and release mechanism of a development of a DevOps lifecycle together from a single a single place, and basically it minimizes the different workflow fragmentation of arranging the build, deploy, and release, and the tools that are involved with it. It is more or less extensible using different plugins that are available, and you can basically use whatever tools that is required for your application to build. And also we saw that one of the cool feature of using Waypoint is that you get certain development tools in respect to debugging your application using Waypoint logs and logging into your deployment using Waypoint Exec. Also, it's currently it is supporting different container runtimes, such as if you want to deploy your code as using a Docker file, that also you can do, or you can simply use the Buildpacks to deploy your application.
Hi,
So,
Sangam. Can we just pause for a minute and take few questions?
yeah, sure. So
Yeah.
I'm just
Is
ending with my talk and
okay.
some of the
Sure.
results. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you can see the questions. Otherwise, I can read that for you. Is Waypoint another tool for pipeline, or how is it different from Jenkins pipeline or GitLab CI?
Yeah, so Waypoint, I would say, is basically, yeah, you can tell it's a tool that is developed not only for a pipeline, but to help
Okay.
the developers to complete the build, deploy, and release phase of the